Hello everybody, it's Miss Fincham. Today we're continuing Unit 2 by covering Topic 1.3, Aquatic or Water Biomes. Thanks to Jordan Smeeds for the slides and note outlines that we use in this class. Our objective today is to describe the factors that determine where aquatic biomes are found and how the species that live in them are adapted to live there and the overall characteristics of each aquatic biome. We also need to be able to describe the global distribution and environmental aspects of aquatic biomes. We will look at different freshwater biomes and how they're an important source of drinking water. And we will also look at different marine biomes, which means ocean-based biomes, and we'll look at how they're an important supply of oxygen globally and an important sink for carbon dioxide globally. Finally, we'll practice explaining an environmental concept and process as our suggested science skill. There are four main characteristics of aquatic biomes. Salinity refers to how much salt is found in a body of water, and it determines which species can survive in this body of water. Depth influences how much sunlight can penetrate the surface of the water and indicates how much sunlight will reach the plants below the surface for photosynthesis. Flow is the movement of water and will determine which plants will survive in the body of water, and it's also going to determine how much dissolved oxygen will be found in the water. Rivers, streams, and rapidly moving bodies of water allow for better mixing of air and water, which leaves more dissolved oxygen in the water. Finally, we have temperatures. This is very important because the warmer a body of water gets, the less dissolved oxygen it can hold, and therefore the less aquatic life it can generally support. That's because organisms in the water, especially animals, are going to require a lot of oxygen from that water. The water needs to have dissolved oxygen in order to support those animals living there. Rivers are generally going to have higher dissolved oxygen levels, and that's because the movement of the water facilitates that mixing of air and water, which leads to oxygen dissolving into the water. We're also going to see high levels of nutrients found in the sediments that are carried along the bottoms of rivers. Lakes, on the other hand, are standing bodies of fresh water, and it's really important that they're fresh because that means they are a source of drinking water around the world. Next, we have the different zones found in the body of water. The littoral zone is the shallow water around the edge of the lake or the pond. It's going to have what we call emergent plants like reeds and cattails, where the roots of the plants are embedded in the bottom of the body of water, but then most of the plant extends up out of the water. The limnetic zone is the zone in the middle, and this is the zone where light can reach and where photosynthesis is able to take place. Then we have the profundal zone, which is too deep for light to reach, so there's not going to be any photosynthesis happening in that zone. Then finally we have the benthic zone, which is kind of like the murky bottom of the body of water, and it's going to feature things like invertebrates that are going to live in that murky bottom, and the soil that's down there is going to be very nutrient rich because of all the sediments that contain organic materials from the other organisms that live above it. Freshwater wetlands are areas where the soil is submerged or saturated with water for at least part of the year, but it's still shallow enough for what we call emergent vegetation, which are plants that have their roots in the soil but extend up and out of the surface of the water. Another key distinguishing factor is that the plants that live in wetlands have to be adapted to live with their roots submerged in water. Most plants will die if their roots are totally submerged in water, and that's because they won't get enough oxygen. They will essentially suffocate. But plants like cattails or lily pads or reeds all have adaptations that allow them to survive in submerged soils. That is the key distinguishing fact of a wetland. They're very important because they have a whole host of benefits. One of them is that they store excess water that comes from surface water, rain, snowmelt, groundwater, or floodwater, which is going to reduce the damage from flooding. 1 acre of wetlands can store up to 1 million gallons of water. Wetlands also provide food and shelter to many different types of animals. In fact, 43% of threatened or endangered animals in the U.S. rely on wetlands to survive, with up to 50% of North American bird species building nests or finding food in a wetlands biome. Here you can see 2 sandhill cranes that are searching for food at Springfield Fenn Nature Preserve up in LaPorte County, Indiana. Wetlands are a really diverse and productive biome, we have 3 examples of different types of freshwater wetlands, and we'll talk about how plants in each habitat are uniquely suited to these conditions. Swamps are our first example of wetlands that are found in floodplains, deltas, and along rivers and lakes. They are also dominated by woody plants like trees and shrubs and can contain both fresh and salt water based on how close to an ocean they are found. They tend to have standing water year-round and are classified by the types of trees that you find growing in them. Often you'll find cypress trees, which are a type of coniferous or pine tree that are uniquely adapted to survive living in submersive soils and swamps in the southern part of the United States. Swamps in Indiana will contain hardwoods, while swamps further north will have cedar trees. Here you can see in our second photo that we have a lily pad swamp that is located in LaPorte County here in Indiana. This is a swamp that does empty into a river and flows water into Lake Michigan. Next we have marshes. They're all going to have reeds and cattails along with soft-stemmed plants and sedges, which are uniquely adapted to survive with their roots totally submerged in water. These can also be fresh or salt water depending on their location and can have standing water year-round. Here you'll find a plant called a marsh marigold in a marsh located in Indiana Dunes National Park along Lake Michigan here in Indiana. Finally, we'll look at bogs, which are found in poorly drained lake basins and in cooler climates, so further north. They are often dominated by a thick mat of moss on top of decayed plant matter called peat. They are great collectors of excess rainwater and are often acidic and have low oxygen levels due to there being very little movement of the water through the biome. If you find a bog that is completely covered by the mat of moss, you can walk on them and it feels like walking on a waterbed. Here we can see the pinhook bog that is also found in the Indiana Dunes National Park in northern Indiana. There are many different benefits of wetlands, including economic ones along with environmental benefits. Wetlands are able to store large amounts of water, which reduces flooding damage to areas, which is an economic benefit, that are frequented with heavy rain. The wetlands also recharge groundwater by absorbing rainfall into the soil, which is an environmental benefit. That means that the water in the wetlands is going to refill aquifers and other underground sources of water that humans rely on. They're also going to provide natural filtration, which is an economic benefit, as we won't have to filter the water that comes out of the wetlands. The roots of the plants are going to trap pollutants that may be in stormwater runoff and prevent those pollutants from getting down into the groundwater beneath. Then finally, they're just great habitats for a whole host of plant life because there's so much water and because the sediments here contain so much organic material, which provides nutrients for these plants. So far we've just talked about freshwater biomes, and before we talk about marine or ocean biomes, we need to first cover estuaries, which are sort of an in-between fresh and saltwater biome. These are going to be a mix of fresh and saltwater because this is where the river empties out into the sea or ocean. They're going to be very productive biomes, and that's because there's going to be a really high level of nutrients contained in the sediments that are deposited in estuaries by the river. The river carries all of these organic sediments and then it deposits them in the estuary where it opens out into the ocean. So that's going to make the floodplains of rivers, the areas where the rivers flood up onto the land surrounding them, or deltas where rivers open out onto the ocean. It's going to make these have really fertile, really productive soil. One type of estuary is a salt marsh. These are estuary habitats found along the coast of temperate climates, and they're going to be really important breeding grounds for a ton of different fish and shellfish species. Organisms will swim into the salt marsh, lay their eggs, which will hatch, and then they'll swim back out in the ocean and live the rest of their life. These areas are really, really important to supporting a bunch of different marine organisms. Here's a picture of a salt marsh. You can see it's kind of the meandering opening of this river that gradually opens out into the ocean. Then we have mangroves. Mangroves are really unique habitats in that they're estuaries that are found only in tropical climates. That means it will be a lot warmer and rainier, and the mangrove swamps are characterized by mangrove trees. These are really neat trees that have super long stilted roots. The mangroves you can see here basically sit up perched kind of upon these roots, and the roots are really key to this habitat. They are going to stabilize the shoreline, so they are going to anchor the soil in place and protect it from storm surges or really high winds. They can absorb a lot of water when there's excess water from rainfall flooding. And then finally, they're going to also provide a super important habitat for a bunch of different fish species that are going to basically swim among these roots. So they're a really vital estuary habitat. Next, we have the coral reef. The coral reef is an ecosystem found in warm, shallow waters beyond the shoreline. It's really important to understand that it is one of the most biodiverse ecosystems on Earth, and it is the most biodiverse ecosystem found in marine biomes. It's going to feature a mutualistic relationship between coral, which is an animal, and algae, which is a plant. The coral take in carbon dioxide out of the ocean, and they're going to create a calcium carbonate shell, which we refer to as the reef. That's their exoskeleton. This is going to provide a home to the algae. The algae will actually live in the coral reef, but then what they'll do is they'll take some of the carbon dioxide that the coral give off during respiration, and they'll use it for photosynthesis to make sugar. The sugars then fuel the coral and provide them with an energy source. It is really important to remember that this is a mutualistic relationship, meaning that neither organism could survive without the other, but when they live together in this mutualistic way, they're able to live in an area that neither of them would be able to survive. The intertidal zone are basically a narrow band of coastline between low and high tides. So when the tide moves out each afternoon, it's going to leave a lot of the area exposed to sunlight, and there's also going to be a lot of crashing waves, which requires the species that live in the intertidal zone to be able to basically hang on to the rocks there and anchor themselves. We'll see that species like barnacles, sea stars, and crabs are going to have adaptations that allow them to attach themselves to rocks and resist being pulled out when the tide goes out. Another adaptation that they need to have is a tough outer shell or tough skin that prevents them from being dried out by that harsh sunlight that they're going to be exposed to at low tide, as this prevents desiccation, which is basically the drying out of the organism. But we'll see here when we look at the diagram is that different organisms are uniquely adapted to live at different levels of the intertidal zone. For example, we have the spiral rack, which is a type of seaweed that's adapted to live at the high tide zone because it can kind of curl up on itself and secrete a mucus, which acts as kind of a moisturizing substance that prevents it from drying out during low tide. A big important takeaway from the intertidal zone is that the organisms have to be uniquely adapted to live in the intertidal zone in the different areas found within that tide zone. Finally, we will end with the open ocean. The open ocean is a very low productivity biome per unit of area. So for each square meter of the ocean, it is less productive than a square meter of the tropical rainforest. That is because only algae and the phytoplankton can survive in much of the ocean. It's just too deep for most plants to survive, so although there's very low productivity per unit of area, it is such a large biome and it covers so much of the earth that all of the algae and phytoplankton that live in the ocean produce a huge part of the oxygen that we need on earth in order to survive. It's also going to be an important sink for carbon dioxide, meaning that these organisms are going to absorb a lot of carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, and that's going to mitigate or reduce the impacts of global warming because it takes carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. We have a couple zones we should know in the ocean. We have the photic zone, which is this area of sunlight can reach. That's the area where we will see photosynthesis occurring. Then we have the aphotic or the abyssal zone. This is the zone that is too deep for sunlight to reach, so there's no photosynthesis that's going to be occurring here. It's really important we should know that the organisms that live in the abyssal or the aphotic zone are going to need adaptations to survive there. So many of them have adaptation called bioluminescence, which allows them to glow, giving themselves a source of light so they can see and navigate in the dark ecosystem. And also, they're going to need to be adapted to sustain extremely high pressures due to all of the water that's above them. A big theme from all of the aquatic biomes is that the organisms that live in them need to be uniquely adapted to survive the conditions. Our practice FRQ for 1.3 will involve concept explanation. I want you to identify an organism that's found in an aquatic biome and explain how that organism is uniquely adapted to live in that specific biome. Remember to scan your notes and upload them into Canvas when you are finished.